Logical fallacies, the correlation versus causation fallacy. Sometimes two different phenomena or variables rise and fall at the same time. This demonstrates that there is a correlation between the two variables. As a result, some assume that one variable causes the other. In a review of census data, one might examine rates of chronic pain as well as the use of marijuana. Within this context, one might find that those with a high level of chronic pain are more likely to use marijuana. Based on this correlation, one might argue that marijuana causes chronic pain. After all, why else would we refer to marijuana as chronic? But this is not the case. The correlation is likely a result of the fact that sometimes doctors prescribe marijuana to make chronic pain more manageable. This is what's known as a spurious correlation, potentially. Simply put, there's a correlation, but it does not necessarily equal causation. And I do want to focus on the word it does not necessarily equal causation. There are people who have a fundamental misunderstanding of this fallacy and will simply say that correlation does not equal causation. It absolutely can, but it doesn't necessarily. When two variables correlate, it is important to recognize that there might be other variables to consider. If there are other variables, the correlation between two particular variables may be spurious in nature. A spurious correlation happens when two variables have a seemingly causal relationship but are not actually associated. In this context, there may be an unseen confounding variable that is having the impact on the outcome. Simply put, correlation does not necessarily equal causation. Though again, I stress, just because it doesn't necessarily equal causation doesn't mean that there's not a causal relationship. Variables. There are three different variables that we have to consider when trying to determine causal relationships. One is the independent variable, the second is the dependent variable, and the third is the confounding variable. The independent variable is also initialized as IV. It is the factor that is changed, manipulated, or controlled, such as a medication that you might be giving somebody for an illness, and it tests the effect that that variable has on the dependent variable. The dependent variable is initialized as dV, and that factor is the one that is measured, tested, or observed. Within this context, it's tied to outcome or effect. The researcher is trying to determine what the dependent variable does, what the outcome is, or how it is affected by the independent variable. In short, we're looking at changes in response to the independent variable. If somebody is sick, for example, and they take medication, does their temperature go up or do they start to feel better? The confounding variable, initialized as CV, is a variable that exists outside the independent variable and dependent variable and is therefore referred to as an outside variable. It is unmeasured, but it does have an influence on both cause and or effect. Example, you might be measuring the growth of plants, and in that context, measuring how much water you add or don't add. However, there is another confounding variable, and that is sunlight. If you've put some of the plants you're watering in windows that face north-south and others that face east-west, some of those plants will be getting more sun than other plants. So that confounding variable can have an impact on outcome that might poison your results. In short, when the confounding variable is unaccounted for, it can distort data and lead to false associations, aka the correlation causation fallacy, which our friends from Rome would call the cum hoc ergo propter hoc. And the good thing about the fact that all native speaking Latin speakers no longer exist is that none of them are here to be appalled by my woeful pronunciation of that term. Let us take a look at an example. We have a politician here, fictional of course, we'll give him a name. Let's say he is Tronald Dump. And Tronald Dump notes that whenever the homicide rates go up, the ice cream sales also go up. And because he's trying to protect American Second Amendment right to bear arms, he asserts that we do not need gun control. Instead, he asserts that we need to regulate ice cream. So, if we're trying to determine a causal relationship, how do we determine one when we see a correlation? There's two strategies that you can use to determine whether or not there is a causal relationship. First, you must account for variables. And second, if you can't identify any or the variables are not conclusive, you can triangulate data. Let us begin with accounting for variables. Example, the writing support desk wants to raise its profile on campus so that more students know about and in turn use the service. To achieve this, the team begins doing classroom visits at the beginning of the semester. The first semester, they visit 30 classrooms. That semester, there is an increase of 300 unique users. The next semester, the team visits a total of 40 classrooms. In this context, they see an increase of 350 unique users. The next semester, they visit 70 classrooms. That semester, they see an increase of 500 unique users. There is clearly a correlation, but is there a causal relationship? What other variables are there to consider? What about enrollment? That can certainly have an impact on student usage. The first semester, there was 15,000 students enrolled. The second semester, there was also 15,000 students enrolled. And the third semester, there were only 14,000 students enrolled. So we actually see a slight decline by the third semester. However, the increase still correlates with the classroom visits, but not with the enrollment. What about the number of writing assignments? If the service is providing support for writing, if there's more writing assignments, that might lead to an increase in unique users. In the first semester, there were 12,000 writing assignments. In the second semester, there were 11,000. And in the third semester, there was only 10,000. So we actually see again in this context that the number of writing assignments is not correlated to the number of unique users, and therefore we can dismiss the fact that the number of writing assignments is a confounding variable. International student enrollment could also be a confounding factor. If, for example, we know that international students make up 60% of the writing support desk's users, then an influx in international students could lead to an influx in unique users. In the first semester, there were 8,000 international students enrolled in the school. In the second semester, there were only 7,000 international students enrolled. And in the third semester, there were only 6,000 international students enrolled. So we see that there is not a positive correlation between international student enrollment and unique users, and we can therefore exclude international student enrollment as a confounding variable. None of these variables, whether it's enrollment, international student enrollment, or the number of writing assignments, has a correlation with the number of unique users at the writing support desk. It is therefore reasonable to conclude that there is a causal relationship between in-class visits and unique users. Let us next take a look at triangulation. We're going to assume that the numbers relating to enrollment, international students, and writing assignments in this context all correlate positively with the increase in unique users. If that's the case, how can we tell if there is a causal relationship between in-class visits and unique users? We triangulate. In this context, we can send out a survey asking students who use the service where they heard about the service. Obviously, we're going to give them a number of options on there, but one of those options will be in-class visits. After the first semester, we learned that 25 students reported that they heard about the writing support desk through in-class visits. In the second semester, when there was a slight increase, we saw another increase. 35% of students reported that they'd first heard about the writing support desk through an in-class visit. And finally, when we pumped those visits up to 70 visits altogether, we see a further increase where 45% of students said that they heard about the writing support desk through in-class visits. With other variables accounted for, this additional data provides evidence that the relationship between in-class visits and unique users is causal in nature. Because there is a positive correlation between the number of students who reported learning about the service through in-class visits, the dependent variable, and the number of in-class visits, the independent variable, a causal relationship can be determined between the independent variable, the in-class visits, and the dependent variable, the number of unique users. Therefore, we can determine that the correlation between in-class visits and unique users is causal in nature. Now it's time for a quick summary. Sometimes two different phenomena or variables are correlated. However, correlation does not necessarily equal causation. And do remember that's really key. It's not that correlation does not equal causation, it's that it does not necessarily equal causation. Such instances may be examples of spurious correlations. And as we discussed, a spurious correlation happens when two variables have a seemingly causal relationship but are not actually causally associated with one another. This occurs because there may be a confounding variable that hasn't been observed or studied that does have an impact on effect and outcome. The confounding variable is the outside variable that may not have been considered by the researcher but does have an impact on the dependent variable. Keeping in mind again, dependent variables are the part of the research that remains static. They remain the same. Research observes potential changes in the dependent variable based on the independent variable. The independent variables are the part of the research that is changed. Research observes whether it has an impact on the dependent variable. If we add water, do the plants grow? If we give medicine, does the illness go away? There are two ways to determine if the correlation is also causal. First, we identify all potential variables and test for correlations. Second, we triangulate data. If other variables have no impact or if the data triangulation verifies the causal nature of a correlation, then it's reasonable to assert that there is a causal relationship between two items that are correlated. So that is the basics of the correlation causation fallacy. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to leave them in the comments section below or book an appointment with the writing support desk. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.